and 3.2 are seeking projects that can commence from August 2024 and can be operationalised by early 2025. Projects that can be delivered after early 2025 will be considered by exception by the Tender Evaluation Committee. Move on to the next slide. Under the Closing the Gap initiative, DCJ is one of the lead agencies responsible to expand the Aboriginal community controlled sector in various human services, including housing and homelessness. This aligns with our strategic priority to improve outcomes for Aboriginal people and communities across New South Wales. DCJ is working internally to improve staff capability and engagement with Aboriginal markets and procurement from Aboriginal providers as the first step to expanding the sector. DCJ is continually working to make the department a more attractive partner to Aboriginal organisations in contracting and service delivery. So as such, the Tranche 3 procurement key objectives are to strategically increase the number of Aboriginal-led core and cluster projects in priority locations, to address issues of geographical imbalance in areas where there are no core and cluster proposals received or there are known service delivery gaps for women's refuges, and to identify projects that can commence from August 2024 and that can be operationalised by early 2025. Projects that can be delivered, as I've said before, could be after that date, could be considered by exception by the Tender Evaluation Committee. Applications for the EOI phase were accepted from all areas of New South Wales, with priority being given to applications from Aboriginal-led organisations and applications in areas that address high need and where access to services is limited. The locations of these new refuges target areas of high unmet demand for crisis accommodation, with a focus on regional and rural areas to ensure women escaping domestic and family violence can access the services they need as close to home as possible. Developments on LAC land. Community housing providers who are required to gain in principle support from Land and Housing Corporation if they're making applications through the funding program for development on the LAC land. So please contact the email on our screen there for the LAC partnerships and communication. So Safe Places program, just a bit of information about this because this is the Commonwealth funded program which applications close for this on the 14th of November, and we're strongly encouraging our applicants for both Tranche 3.1 and 3.2 to consider applying for the Safe Places emergency accommodation program as well as the core and cluster funding. The Safe Places program is a vital funding source for specific target groups. It focuses on the emergency accommodation for women and children experiencing family and domestic violence. The Safe Places inclusion round is now open for applications, and the application closes, the deadline for closing is the 14th of November. The program is aimed at organisations involved in building, renovating or purchasing emergency accommodation for victims of family and domestic violence. It's essential for organisations to meet the specific criteria outlined in the grant guidelines. If your organisation is interested in applying for funding through the Safe Places program, please act quickly and visit the Grant Connect website to find more details and submit an application. We strongly encourage you to have a look at this option. Safe Places will provide the capital funding for your build, and if you're successful, the core and cluster would also provide the service delivery funding. So we are working closely with our colleagues in DSS around aligning these two opportunities for funding for women's refuges and as a way to expand our women's refuges. So please do have a look at that Safe Places emergency accommodation program and consider whether you'd like to apply for that as well as for core and cluster. Moving on to the next slide, our core and cluster overview for the project priority pipeline. This is also something that's changed since the last two rounds of procurement. So the funding for the core and cluster program is a historic level of investment, as I've mentioned before, but it is still finite. As we embark on this discussion, we need to begin with understanding that the priority approved pipeline is a mechanism designed to handle potential additional funding within the core and cluster program budget. The pipeline provides a structured way to manage these funds. So we'll look at the composition of the priority approved pipeline. So it will be respondents who have successfully met all eligibility criteria through the request for tender evaluation process, which is based on the Tranche 3 RFT priorities. This ensures that organisations included in the pipeline are well aligned within our program's objectives. The priority approved pipeline is not an indefinite arrangement. The validity will extend for 12 months from the conclusion of the Tranche 3 RFT process. The timeframe allows us to make strategic decisions within a reasonable horizon, accounting for potential program changes and landscape changes. It's essential to note that after a 12-month period, a new procurement process may be initiated if we had additional funding, and that the new process is necessary to determine and select future projects for the core and cluster program. So the priority approved pipeline isn't a guarantee of future contracts, but it does serve as a dynamic tool for efficient resource allocation and allows the department the opportunity to negotiate directly with providers who have met the criteria. Lastly, the priority approved pipeline is crucial to the procurement strategy. It will help be used to invite identified organisations to negotiate for future contracts related to the core and cluster program, enabling streamlined and organised approach and ensuring that we're working with entities that align with our program objectives and priorities. So this is a new development that we've brought in for Tranche 3. So we'll move on to our next slide, which is around the core and cluster development of data privacy. This might just need a little bit of explanation and context. We've learnt through the previous tranches that there's obviously a need to ensure that the addresses of the refuges remain private. And it's important to start to think about that at the very early commencement of your planning and discussions with council. So this slide steps out the approach that needs to be taken just to flag with councils that your development is for a women's domestic and family violence refuge, and how to ensure that the address and the purpose of the build remains private and isn't disclosed through any means that is available to the general public, or could then put women and children at risk. So there's some clear steps here that DCJ would meet with the core and cluster development tranche recipients to discuss data privacy, that core and cluster developers and their town planner consultants are to request to meet with the council's town planning and record management staff if it's a local development, and DPE if it's a regionally significant planning development, and lodge that DA through the planning panel, but make sure they know what it's for and the need to keep that address private. If you have questions and concerns about that as you progress, please put them through the portal and you can speak with us. We will support you with this, and we have been doing this for our other approved projects from Tranche 1 and Tranche 2. So core and cluster developers and their town planning consultants should ensure that both the town planning staff and records management staff in attendance of the meeting are made aware of the sensitivity of the development, and that there is an express need for privacy and discretion. This includes no public or adjoining owner notification, and that all DA property files to be clearly marked confidential, with any street address and development description use of the building being redacted from documentation required under a GIPA records request. So we're taking the privacy very seriously, and we have got those steps in place to make sure that women and children's safety is at the forefront of what we're doing. So if we just go on to the next slide, this just really talks about the two different phases, pre-DA and with the DA submission and post-DA. So again, that we make sure that we're adhering to what we need to do with privacy and engaging our developers in this process at the very start, that developers and planning consultants discuss this with councils and record this, and that DPE planning panel staff prior, if the planning panel, if there's a panel that the DA needs to go to. So it's just really outlining again what was on the previous slide and where this sits in the pre-DA, DA submission and post-DA. But again, if you've got questions as we progress through the process, please don't hesitate to reach out to us either through the procurement the procurement channels, or later down in the process, if you are successful, to continue working with us on this. We work closely with DPE, and where there are particular questions for particular projects, we will also work with you on that as we go forward. And I think that's it for me, Connor. So I think we're on to handing over to Warren Yates, who's our Manager of Property and Assets, who will speak about the development approval considerations and the learnings from the EOI phase. So I'll hand over to you, Warren.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Just the next slide. Thanks, Connor. All right. Look, thanks very much. I'll probably take about 10 minutes to go through things this morning. So just firstly, in terms of the land or asset provision, we are looking at organisations, community housing providers that have the capacity and capability to contract with the department and deliver a core and cluster refuge in accordance with the Domestic Violence Crisis Accommodation Functional Design Brief. So in accordance with the functional design brief. So delivery can be through either one of two methods. The first one is effectively what we colloquially know as a refurbishment model, where existing assets on land are secured and used / upgraded to meet the core and cluster requirements, or a new build model, where land is secured and new assets are proposed. So as part of that, the community housing provider will need to secure land through effectively one of three ways: by using existing land. Second one is purchasing land with government-owned funds. And then the third one is securing a long-term lease from a third party on a block of land or with some existing assets on it, and that's for a period of 15 years or greater. And it is important to note that the Department of Communities and Justice will be required to register its statutory interest on the land or the lease, and it will be the applicant's responsibility to ensure that this is possible. Jump to the next slide. Thanks, Connor. So in terms of land provision, this is some of the learnings that we've taken from the EOI process. But what we are really looking at is to see if the site you're putting forward as part of your request for tender can be secured and can deliver a core and cluster model in a timely manner. So that's really what we're looking for. So in terms of securing the site, if you don't already own the site, so if you're not using existing land or having a lease on a site, we're not expecting respondents to have a binding contract with a vendor. What we're looking for is other forms of agreement or intent to enter into an agreement to secure that land. So examples of some of those forms are a heads of agreement, an option agreement, signing something like an exclusive dealing period, or an intent to transact with an agent or something along those lines. But we're really looking at engagement with the vendor, which gives us some confidence that you've started to go down this process, and then we are looking at mitigating the risk of securing that site. So that's really important to see, and we actually consider that as part of the assessment process. Then the second step of that is then in terms of developing the site. So once we can secure the site, is the site actually developable for a core and cluster model? And what is the risk of that site not being developable or not being developable in a timely manner? We just want to see that this has been thought through by the respondent and that risk has been mitigated. So at this stage, what we're looking for at the request for tender stage is really some desktop due diligence from the respondent to confirm that the site is not significantly constrained. So what are the common issues that we've seen come up through the EOI process? So the common issues from a sort of a physical constraint point of view, flood and bushfire are the most two common ones, but we also have seen heritage come through to some extent. And then probably the other one that we see coming forward is that we see sites that may not be appropriately zoned. So are the sites zoned appropriately for a core and cluster model? And then what is the appropriate planning approval pathway? Is the site zoned so that we can actually develop a core and cluster model? So that's what we really want to see coming forward. In terms of the planning approval pathways, the three key pathways, and we do note that the functional design brief notes that the likely use in terms of a planning approval for a core and cluster model is either a permanent or a transitional group home. So what are then the planning approval pathways for a permanent or transitional group home? So the three key planning approval pathways are development without consent, and that's only for models that are up to 10 bedrooms in size. That's not 10 units, that's 10 bedrooms. And that's by a public authority only. So that's effectively that's really an option only for sites that are owned by LAC. And I think some respondents are considering that. Second planning approval pathway is a complying development. Hello, sorry. The second planning approval pathway that's open to a transitional or a permanent group home for core and cluster models is a complying development certificate. So once again, that's only available if the model is up to 10 bedrooms in size. And that's done through the housing, the state environmental planning policy, the housing SEP from 2021. And then the third one, which I think the bulk of the proposals will go through, is development with consent. So that's through the local council authority, and that's where we start to get in, obviously, with the data privacy stuff that Sarah's just spoken about. So anything over 10 bedrooms will have to go through that development application through council process. So as part of how we review the responses, we're really looking to see that the responses have considered those items and addressed those items that we've listed above. And that is taken into account as part of our tender assessment process. And we also want to see that those items are included in your development program. Do you want to go on to the next slide, Connor? So the next slide is about some resources that are available to you guys as respondents around where do I find some information about, is my site flood affected, etc. So the key things that you do have available, the first one is what's called a Section 10.7 planning certificate. So this provides basic planning and property information on your proposed site. It includes information about the key constraints. So is it heritage listed? Is it bushfire prone, etc. They cost about $150. They can be sourced online or through the local council. So we'd recommend as part of the due diligence process that you do get a Section 10.7 certificate. Similarly, there's the New South Wales Planning Portal Spatial Viewer, and I've got the website address there. So that contains very similar information to the Section 10.7 certificate. But it also does have a nice summary of the site that you're proposing to develop. So you'll plug in the site address, it pulls up sort of some of the key figures, what's the zoning, what are the height restrictions, etc. So that's actually really useful. And just on your right is just an example of one of the bushfire maps that's actually come from that New South Wales Planning Portal Spatial Viewer. So that's the type of information that you do get. In terms of specific information on flood, so we do see a lot of flood impacted properties. The local councils are the keeper of all flood information. So the quality and quantity of information that you get from council is very much dependent on the individual council. Some councils have really detailed online mapping tools that you can do a lot of online searching and find flood levels on site. Other councils have nothing and actually force you to go through a process of purchasing a flood certificate to provide flood information. It is important to note that we always do recommend, if you suspect the site of being flood affected, that you actually speak to council, once again noting those privacy issues that Sarah mentioned previously. The other thing about floods is it's not only important to consider the actual flood impact of your site, but there's also an indirect impact that you do need to consider. So if your site is not flood affected, but you're in a flood area, there is the potential that you need to consider flood egress. So if there is a flood and your site gets cut off, council may not give you approval to develop a core and cluster model. So that's just one thing to note. And that's actually an example I have been through in developing a group home many years ago. Effectively, we proposed a site that became an island in a flood, and council refused to give us consent to build the group home. So it actually is an issue that you need to consider. The other thing is, if you are considering developing a site that is flood impacted, you may need to engage or speak to a consultant engineer, a flood engineer, and that can be a costly exercise. That's one thing that you just may need to consider. In terms of bushfire information, to get bushfire information on your property, the Section 10.7 certificate or the New South Wales Planning Portal are really useful tools for that. They will give you advice if your site is directly impacted by bushfire, or if it's in a bushfire buffer zone. The other resource that is really available, the two other resources are bushfire consultants and the Rural Fire Service. Normally the Rural Fire Service only give you information if you actually submit an application, but it can always, it can't hurt to have a chat to them if you are considering developing on a bushfire affected site. The other ones are bushfire consultants. Quite a few bushfire consultants have a very cheap service where they'll do a desktop opinion on your site. If you are planning to develop or put forward a site that's in a bushfire buffer zone, they will be able to tell you whether, in their opinion, whether they think it is possible to develop it or not possible to develop it based on that group home planning approval process. So that's some resources that are available for you in terms of bushfires. In terms of the planning approval pathway, there is some really good information in the functional design brief that I spoke to you earlier about. I think section 2, the functional design brief, it is really useful if you have a read through that. The other one is the housing SEP and the group home provisions in the housing SEP. That's really good to get a handle on as well. The second one, probably the one that we do recommend is, and Sarah did allude to it, is getting a town planning consultant engaged early. We think it is really valuable exercise, and especially finding a town planning consultant that's familiar with these types of developments. For a relatively modest fee, they will pretty much cover all the above due diligence information that I've been through, and they'll be able to tell you whether they think a site is developable, or if there are significant constraints to it, what those constraints are and what additional work or what additional advice you need to get. So as I said, we see this as being really valuable, and it also demonstrates to us as government that you understand the risks of developing on your site. So as I said, it's something that we think is worthwhile. Next slide, thanks, Connor. In terms of designing, so I guess the key thing that we're looking for as part of when we look at the tenders and when we're assessing the tenders, we want to see how your proposal responds to the functional design brief. That's really the key thing that we want to see. And there's two ways that you can do this as part of your request for tender. The first one is by providing a floor plan. Whilst it's not a requirement, we always think this is really good. A picture tells 1,000 words. What it does do, it enables us to pictorially tell us whether you've understood the functional design brief and that you're proposing a solution that's really going to be a really good core and cluster model going forward. If you can't provide a floor plan, as I said, it's not a must. We'd love to see one, but please provide a description. A description on how those spaces will interact with each other, how the spaces will support that functional design brief, how the residents will use the spaces, that type of thing. That's what we really want to see. So some of the key considerations that you need to sort of work through as part of that process. So I've just pulled out some of the really high level ones in the functional design brief. The first one is size of the proposal. So the functional design brief sets out what it says is an ideal size, and that ideal size is 6 units that support sort of 12 to 20 people. If we are looking at things, if we are looking at proposals that are larger than that, we really want to see them demonstrate how they support the objectives in the functional design brief. So that's one thing that you really need to demonstrate if you're going above that 6 unit size. Flexibility is another one. So the functional design brief calls up providing flexible spaces. So we really want to see how your proposal meets that. Obviously, the functional design brief does provide the dual key model as an example for how it can support different family sizes. So that's one of the things, that we're looking for. But really the key thing is, how do we have those flexible unit sizes and how do we allow those unit sizes to cater for families of different size that may be accessing those individual units. And then the third one really is around the spatial relationships. So how does everything work together and work as an effective core and cluster model? So the thing is, how does the core interact with the cluster units is really important. How do the external areas act with the cluster units is really important as well. And how do spaces such as yarning circles interact with the overall development? They're the type of things that we're looking for through the design phase. Last slide for me, Connor, I think. So the last slide is then the delivery or the actual development itself, which then rolls into the asset management. So what are the things that we're looking for? We're really keen to see that you've got a good team proposed for the project and a structure that sort of supports a development of this nature and this size. A good project manager leading it is something we like to see, and the experience of that project manager is really important to us. And then some of your consultants as well that you're proposing. In terms of organisational experience, what we're looking for is around, can your organisation deliver in the area? And this really also then starts to reach into that asset management side of things. Obviously, we've got to maintain the assets for quite a long period of time, so we want to make sure that you can service those assets in that area for that sort of that long period of time. And then probably lastly, and I do apologise, it's not on the slide, is the program. So we are really looking to see a realistic program. So as part of the tender assessment process, we normally have an opinion on how long a development takes, and what we want to see is that your program roughly aligns with that. So we want to see that you've understood the site constraints, you've understood the planning approval pathway, and you've given the appropriate timeframes to that planning approval pathway and that overall development time. So that realistic program really shows that you, as the respondent, it shows to us that you've understood what you're doing and understand that development process. So that's probably it from me, Connor. Probably gone a bit longer than planned.
No, that was perfect. Thank you very much, Warren. Now, before I go through a procurement process, I'd like to introduce Tranquility Clinton to discuss probity protocols for the program. Tranquility, good morning.
Morning all. Next slide, thanks, Connor. Thank you. So I'm Tranquility Clinton from RSM. We've been engaged as the independent probity advisors overseeing this process. Our role is to make sure that all participants are being treated fairly and equally, and that the key probity principles are being adhered to. We've been working with the project team to make sure the process is consistent, it's transparent, and that conflicts of interest have been managed appropriately. With respect to the upcoming process, there are a few elements that I wanted to touch base with the participants about. In preparation of your response, there should be no unauthorised communication or improper assistance requests with DCJ or any of its advisors. So there is a process that's been established for you to ask questions, for you to clarify your understanding. Please use those channels. Please do not reach out to anybody else that you may know within the department or who are part of the teams that are supporting this process. We need to make sure that everything goes through the formal channels. When it comes to submitting your proposal or your application, and I cannot stress this enough, please make sure you understand the terms and conditions, that you've read and fully understand the evaluation criteria, and that you put your best foot forward. Part of my role is to oversee the evaluations and to make sure that the evaluation panel are assessing you based on the information that's been put forward. So you need to make sure that when you do put forward your proposal, that it's clear, that it's concise, and that it includes all of the information to assist the evaluation panel to be able to evaluate you on the evaluation criteria. Connor, that's really it from me, but if anybody has any concerns, my contact details are on this slide, and I believe they've been included within the RFT document as well.
Right.
Thanks,
Thank you very much for that. Thank you, Tranquility. Okay, now I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes or so going through the procurement process for Tranche 3, as well as a little bit of feedback on proposals more generally. Looking at the process more generally, there are two concurrent processes. There's a broad stream, Tranche 3.1, and then 3.2 is a targeted Aboriginal-led stream. The RFT response form is to be submitted through a Procurement Central platform, as detailed in the next few slides. And the RFT is broadly comprised of 4 evaluation stages. So there's the conformance and completeness check, essentially where we as a team go through all of the responses to make sure that all the mandatory information is there and that all the eligibility criteria has been met. Then they move on to an evaluation assessment, which is undertaken by district tender evaluation committees, or TECs as they're known. The TECs review the qualitative aspects of the responses before considering pricing information and combining those. That combination of the qualitative and the pricing information is done through a comparative assessment, and then a value for money assessment is undertaken to assess rankings and get final recommendations. From there, the TECs hand over their recommendations to a steering committee who carry out more of a holistic review of the TEC recommendations and endorse the project recommendations. Looking at the evaluation criteria, this information is available in the RFT introduction document, but during the evaluation phase, the text will score responses against the qualitative criteria above out of 10. So each organization will then be ranked according to their final score, so the sum of those 10 criteria on the left-hand side of the screen. And then the text will undergo a comparative value for money assessment, which essentially goes through all of the items on the right-hand side of the screen to give a further weighting to your scores. At that stage, the project steering committee will review all scoring and ensure that the projects align with state priorities and endorse project recommendations for awarding and funding. Now, this slide is really around sort of submitting that question, which is what I alluded to at the top of the presentation. At the outset, I'd like to say that please ensure that your details in Procurement Central platform are up to date and that any nominated contacts are included. That is how we will reach out to you through the Procurement Central platform, so it is imperative that your details are kept up to date. A quick note there on the second point that with response envelopes, there are two envelopes. There's a technical envelope and a qualification envelope, both of which need to be completed. But this really just goes through each of those key documents review, being the RFT introduction document, which I mentioned. There is the core and cluster high-level specifications and the conditions of tendering, which I would encourage you to be very familiar with. It's also recommended that respondents read and understand other important documents linked in section 5.1 of the introduction document. So there is a hyperlink in that introduction document to a variety of documents that you should also get very familiar with. If you can't find them in the introduction document, all key documents are also available for download in the attachments tab of Procurement Central. Notifications more generally and correspondence will come through the Procurement Central portal. So again, please ensure that all your contact details are kept up to date. Responses will be provided via an addendum for transparency's sake, and email notifications will be provided to the registered email address once those addendums are published. If your organization has had multiple projects advance from EOI through to RFT, please follow the instructions set out in section 2.16 of the response envelope. There's a little screenshot of it there on screen for you, but there's no need to submit a separate RFT for each site. In fact, it helps us to assess them in a more streamlined manner, and it will save you a little bit of work in terms of resubmitting your core company information as well. Now, if you notice on the bottom left of the screen by section 216.2, there is a little exclamation triangle there. That will turn into a paperclip once you're working through your document, which will indicate that there's actually a form for you to download on that section. So that one there is actually a supplier response form that will allow you to populate information for a different location. Now, please note that the format for attaching information from multiple sites has changed a little bit since the EOI. So there will still be a form that you need to download, populate, and then attach. But instead of having a zip folder with all project attachments, we've allowed for the uploading of specific supporting documentation. So in the screenshot here, we have a variety of fields with a description, but also allowing you to either drop or browse for a file to submit your response. If you're submitting a joint response on behalf of a joint venture, partnership, or as a consortium, the department is more than willing to accept those, but they will only consider a single response form from a lead legal entity of that joint venture, partnership, or consortium. It's also important to note that consortium must be established as a duly constituted legal entity. So please consider the company formation and the legal personhood of the entity that you're putting forward as your applicant. The next couple slides have a few key details for this opportunity. It's important to note that you can save your work as you go and come back to your submission through the Procurement Central platform. A couple hyperlinks there for tenders, .newsouthwales.gov.au, where you can find the opportunity and log into e-tendering. There's the Bravo Solutions website as well. In the middle of that slide, you'll see RFX details for the general stream, that's 3.1, and the Aboriginal-led stream, which is 3.2. It's important to have that RFX reference number and correspondence if you're reaching out to us. And also just to note that the closing date is 11 a.m. on Monday, the 31st of January, with the last day for inquiries, the 17th of January. Now, just one sort of transition slide comment is really not to leave it to the last minute. I really can't stress enough that you should submit well ahead of that deadline on the end of January. If you leave it to the last minute, you are sure to reach a technical problem with either a blackout or your internet failing or whatever is going to get in your way. But late tender submissions will be marked as a late response by the system automatically, and it will be up to the text team the discretion to actually consider it for evaluation. But that's only if it doesn't affect the integrity of the procurement. So best not to put yourself in that position and just submit a little bit early and give yourself a little bit of time. If you do experience technical issues, there's a customer support email and phone number there with hours of operation. And if you can't get your issue resolved through that customer support line, there's another line there where you can escalate through to. For questions and queries around process or probity, I've also included Tranquility's email address there, but also contact details for Sarah Bradford. So if you have a probity or procurement process issue, please respond to both of them. Now, finally, in this little package, once again, tender addendums will be submitted through Procurement Central. These can be viewed on the Procurement Central portal message board. So you go to your Messages tab and New Messages. And on the flip side, you can send messages to the team through the Procurement Central portal message board through Messages and Create Message. All of the messages for the procurement will be issued through here. And just another reminder that we will be stopping to accept new questions from 5 p.m. on Monday, the 17th of January. And now I'm just going to move on to a little bit of sort of a high-level sort of walkthrough of the core and cluster proposals and some target feedback for you guys. Now, you may very well recall seeing this slide before during the EOI stage, and I raised this here, and to be fair, the next few slides to reiterate the goal of the project and what you should be focused on and addressing. So please give due weight to each of the 4 components above. That's the land provision, asset delivery, service delivery, and asset maintenance. All have to be detailed in your response. So please make sure that you turn to this on a revisionist basis to make sure that you're covering off all of those aspects in your application. Now, this slide details asset design considerations. There are a number of elements that go into good design for a core and cluster project, but I urge you to revisit the slide at various stages of developing your response to make sure that you're still addressing the considerations on this slide. Is the safety and security of the building site, including access to refuge, surveillance,